Hi everyone, welcome to this second video lecture for digital hermeneutics. This week in class we are going to do some close reading, but before we actually get around to that, I want to give you a little bit of context. Today I'll talk about an approach to literature that was called practical criticism, and most notably through the psychologist I.A. Richards. His ideas on how to read poetry later led to the formalist movement known as New Criticism, and they are the ones most commonly associated with close reading. The New Critics were a proper school of people. It's a warranted term because they considered themselves a proper group. Most of them were at Yale in the first half of the 20th century, and they focused a lot on poetry. They were the ones who developed close reading, but they also had a bunch of very strong opinions on what to not do when you're interpreting. Now, today, New Criticism is old news. It was replaced by other movements such as deconstructionism and new historicism and so on. But by the end of this lecture, I hope that it will become clear that the kinds of questions the new critics were asking about poetry and the inventive ways in which they analyzed the aesthetic structure of these texts are still very relevant to the kinds of analyses that we can undertake, even when engaging with big data. Two folks had an especially great influence on the new critics. The first is Matthew Arnold, and he was a 19th century poet and also a school inspector. And these two vocations are relevant. Arnold wrote a defense of what he considered culture in his book Culture and Anarchy. Now, those two words say a lot because in Arnold's mind, they are sort of the two options we have as a society. Arnold was somewhat of a conservative and he had a very specific idea about what culture should be. So basically one of the definitions of the term that we looked at last week. And that's the idea of culture as development. He noted that culture is the best that had been thought and said. Now, it kind of spontaneously follows from that Arnold has very few good words to spare for what would today be called popular culture. He calls it the practices of the raw and uncultivated masses. Anyway, Arnold has a problem because around the time he's living, modern democracy is kicking in and the male working class masses are becoming more powerful by the minute. They're becoming dangerous. To Arnold, these working class people were becoming powerful, but they hadn't developed a cultural awareness yet. They weren't educated enough to know what to do with that power. He feared that the decline of religion that he saw around him, which went alongside the rise of this new middle class, would result in a divided society with no common system of beliefs and values, which is to him quite dangerous. He saw literature in this sense as a replacement for religion. Note again this relationship between religion and literature that we also touched upon last week. The latter takes the place of the former. So the role of the critic was to help people to recognize the best that had been thought and said in the world. And this conservative goal of the literary critic to Arnold was about attaining a kind of pure, disinterested knowledge, simply appreciating the object as it in itself really is, without going into a specific line of action. So it's both depoliticizing and depersonalizing literature and criticism. Second, there's T.S. Eliot, the modernist poet, a critic also, who was a contemporary of the new critics. Like Arnold, he had written a lot about poetry and about the canon of taste that was being developed at the time. He thought that poetry must be difficult, and he had a better reason for that than Arnold did. His point was, poetry has to reconcile all kinds of different experiences. The sound of the typewriter, the smell of cooking, reading Spinoza, all of it has to be mixed in. Preferably the metaphysical aspects, that is, the impersonal aspects, things that are, as he put it, common to all mankind. Now, this idea of a depoliticized and depersonalized metaphysical reading in our day seems absurd. We are extremely concerned with the political implications of art, with issues of representation and power and so on. And we are also very highly attendant to ideas about identity and personal ramifications that art might have. And while these things are obviously incredibly important, to read art only politically or personally can be a bit of an impoverishment as well. I think that most contemporary critical readers would be better off by looking at how art, or maybe language in general, works formalistically. The whole idea of formalism, of course, is based on the same demands of scientific rigor as the digital humanities is based on these days. One of the forefathers of new criticism and close reading is a literary critic called I.A. Richards. Here he is, recreating his own version of that painting we saw last week. Romanticism still is fully relevant, as you can tell, and you'll see this in some of his ideas as well. Richard was a literary critic at Cambridge, but before he came there, he was trained as a behavioral psychologist, a Pavlovian. He was very interested in how the psyche responds to literature, how the experience of reading is structured. Both him and his direct student, William Empson, who also became a very important figure, they take seriously the idea that there might be a scientific basis for literary studies. Richards had some quite interesting ideas about poetry and human experience, which I think might not be as scientifically accurate as he had hoped, but are surely interesting to understand as a humanities scholar. Ideas about the value of art, why it's worthy of all this devotion, and the capacity of language, the fragility of understanding something. Like I said, Richards was also into poetry, quite heavily so. His idea was that we needed to read poetry in terms of the momentous decision of the will that inspired it, from which we could then learn greater values. Poetry could be used for the ordering of our minds, or even the ordering of personality itself, in his view. So we can become better versions of ourselves by reading poetry. Now, that's a typical lofty way of viewing poetry that the new critics also help to establish. And as you have probably also noticed, this focus on the greatness of literature resembles Arnold's point quite a bit. Art as the pinnacle of culture, the best that had been thought and said. Richard's book here, Practical Criticism, had as its goal to prepare new educational methods. As he put it, developing the power to understand what we hear and read. Your life is only as good, he says, as your capacity to read poetry is. Now, beneath this, he was quite cynical, critical of what was being taught in literature classrooms at the time. The idle hours of most lives, he wrote, are filled with reveries that are simply bad private poetry. Anyway, that's how Richards comes to this idea of practical criticism. Right, so how did he want to go about it? Well, in his classes with his students, he gave poems to his students without any information about who wrote them or when they were written. He did this in order to encourage students to concentrate on the words on the page, as he called it, rather than relying on preconceived or received beliefs about a text. His main question was, how does a piece of writing communicate to the reader, and how is the reader able to explain what is communicated? How do you, as a reader, communicate precisely what is going on in a text? And finally, do poems look different if they are presented in isolation from the circumstances in which they were created? And do critical responses change if the reader is aware of contextual information? In other words, how do we read a literary work without knowing its context, whether it's a period or a political or intellectual background, stylistic conventions, and so on? As someone with an interest in psychology, Richards wanted to undertake an experiment. He had students reading and responding to poems without knowing who the authors were. And he then asked, why did they respond the way they did? Based on these student documentations, he came up with a model of literary criticism, practical criticism. Right, how did he do these experiments? Well, he would pay attention to very small units of language in short lyrical poems, and he'd be interested in how students responded. The objective for students was to focus on words on the page and leave all their preconceived ideas about the text at the door. He then classified their responses into categories, basically a set of problems he identified and how his students read these poems. For instance, the problem with the capacity to visualize and thus understand imagery, or the dependence on a stock or sentimental response, a confusion when students' own beliefs conflict with those in the poem, being misled by personal associations, or a confusion based on a reliance on critical preconception and technical prejudgments. Basically, all these problems indicate a clash between personal experience and those communicated in the poem. The chief cause of these responses, which Richards called ill-appropriate and stereotyped, is a withdrawal from experience. Students did not learn the poem, but understood it based on what others had taught them. So it's really all about independent reading and thinking. And it's good to note here that up until then, literary classes were very much about a teacher lecturing on the verses of poetry, very linear communication by a teacher. It was called appreciative teaching. So all these rapturous evocations of great literary classics. An English teacher would come into the classroom, begin quoting Wordsworth, making these beautiful gestures and emphasizing just how good it was. This was the atmosphere that practical criticism and the new critics found themselves in, and why they wanted to do something different, why they wanted some rigor and some scientific principles inserted into literary criticism. To Richards, this implied that all of the knowledge we have about the context of art is not part of the proper experience of art itself. He saw that his students were confused when they started taking these things into account and wanted to turn away from it. Instead, his goal became a close textual analysis of a work of art. Very pragmatic, very empirical, basically turning literary criticism into a factual and scientific analysis. Now remember, this is a psychologist. He thinks that responding to all these currents of emotion and meaning in the text, students can get a better insight into their own corresponding emotions. So it's this close scientific reading that he considers capable of, and I quote, an opening up of the poem for what it can really be for us, a unique and fascinating experience, carefully wrought by its maker and fully available only to those with the patience, as well as the sensibility to recreate. This too followed from his psychological ideas. His conviction was that as humans we consist of impulses, all these neurons firing away in our nervous system, and that the poet was someone who, as he put it, was capable of connecting these impulses into a single organized response. And he wanted his students to be able to do the same thing in their analysis of these poems. This focus on a single response, in light of this vast complexity of our brain, is where we also see a big difference with last week's hermeneutics. Richard's point is to look at the work of art and see how it reconciles all kinds of opposites. What it also implies is that a poem, to Richards, is not an object. It doesn't have objective existence. It's something more abstract. It's communicated experience. And this is the psychological intervention again. He says there's no need for context in order for that to happen. Language itself ought to produce those impulses. Isn't that wonderful? He's exclaiming, right? We manage to discuss our feeling somehow, to say true things almost in spite of ourselves. So you see, it's quite optimistic. It's about the power of language. As we'll discuss later on, theories like these happen in the midst of what's called the linguistic turn in philosophy, in which theorists started focusing on how language actually constituted reality instead of merely representing it. Richards wrote, "Knowledge is lying dormant in the dictionary." He saw language as a sort of a record, a repository of human nature itself. Now you might say, here we go again with this idea of properly communicated experience, right? Here's another Englishman thinking about great English poets. That's pretty easy, isn't it? It's the same problem as with the hermeneutic philosophers last week, right? Schleiermacher, who emphasized getting into the author's mind, right? Knowing the author better than they did themselves. Great, you might ask, but how does that work with something that's fundamentally different? Does language have the same capacities when it's a language you're not familiar with? For instance, there is this idea of linguistic relativity, sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's a principle claiming that the structure of a language affects its speaker's worldview or cognition. So that means people's perceptions are relative to their spoken language. So how can you then properly talk about communicated experience in different languages? Richard's answer to that is to say, yes, it's personal, but interpretation is also something human. Even if that means you're coming from another context, there might still be something for you to understand that is, in a way, true. So you don't need to be rooted in the intellectual or societal or spiritual context of the artwork. In fact, to Richards, if you're trying to understand the mind of the author, you are compromising your objectivity as a critic. So he doesn't necessarily negate the social character of literary works, the fact that different people experience things differently. Richards is actually quite an important figure for this idea in the humanities that different versions of reality, different paradigms, exist at the same time. Because art is a private experience, there is no correct reading that ends all others. The last important thing is that Richards didn't think there was something like a special aesthetic state. It's sometimes thought that when you look at art, you're in some kind of unique experiential state. But to Richards, the uniqueness of art doesn't mean that it creates some kind of unique experience. When we look at a picture, or read a poem, or listen to music, we're doing something similar to him as when we're on our way to work, on our bicycle, or getting dressed in the morning. The only difference lies in the way in which the experience is caused in us. And as a rule, that is more complex in the arts. And this is also what makes it capable of a more successful and unified response in us. So I think what we can take away from Richards is perhaps not the neurological perspective. This perspective has been criticized since the 1930s already. No one does practical criticism anymore. It contains a claim to scientism that perhaps we don't even need. The whole point of close reading and its value is to get to this idea about the context of reception, to insert the aesthetic into the everyday material experience, to show we are always aesthetically operating, but that the difference between great art and everyday life is just the degree to which those capacities are being triggered. The whole point of close reading and its value is to get to this idea about the context of reception, to insert the aesthetic into the everyday material experience, to show we are always already aesthetically operating, but that the difference between great art and everyday life is just the degree to which those capacities are being triggered. Now, Richard's ideas developed into what is called New Criticism, and new critics to look at poetry. And again, to them, poetry isn't a representation, but it's a world in and of itself. It's a microcosm, it's a distillation or a model of things as they should be, in the sense of being organized and coherent and self-sufficient. Poets don't imitate the world. This is what Plato derided them for, right? They just imitate things and therefore they're less important than philosophers. Instead, the new critic said, what the poet does is construct order out of the messiness of reality. Again, you hear the echo here of practical criticism. Poets don't construct an alternate reality that doesn't have anything to do with the real world, but they sort of idealize reality. That's the cornerstone of formalism to the new critics. It brings form to bear on the messiness of the real. So note that it's not about poetry, but about poems. It's not about the spontaneous overflow of feelings that we talk about when we talk about poetry, that romantic word. It's not just about genius anymore here. It's not about expression. This is where the scientific claim of this school comes in. It's about contained objects, a microcosm. The morality behind this idea of poetry as a microcosm is that of self-sufficiency or autonomy. And that isn't something that the new critics invent. You can look at it in terms that Immanuel Kant already used, the purposeful versus the purposive. Kant's point, and it's a beautiful point, is that art has a special characteristic that nothing else has. Kant talks about the pleasant and the good, and they exist in reference to our faculties of desire and appetency, the sensuous. And the same goes for moral acts, understood by reason. I approve of something or I don't approve of something. My subjectivity, in other words, always determines my attitude towards these things. You can't really tell them apart. But there are also things that just stand there before us. Things that don't exist for me, but for themselves. And Kant is, of course, thinking about art when he says that. And he talks about taste as our relationship to art. And he uses this word because he says, my liking of art has nothing to do with desire or approval. It is, in other words, disinterested. So aesthetics, he says, are not about the purpose of objects in practical terms. This would be purposefulness, right? A question like, what can it do in the world, especially for me? It's about how an aesthetic object is sufficient in and of itself, with its own unique internal dynamicism and coherence, strictly in reference to its own existence. That's what he calls purposive. So to Kant and to the new critics as well, art is something that manifests its self-sufficiency. When Oscar Wilde says at the end of his introduction to Dorian Gray that all art is useless, this is what he means. It is a damn remarkable thing that art can do that, to be useless. We don't have to have an interest in it, in the sense of owning a product or a company in order to appreciate it. It has intrinsic value. It's not about our use of it or our want of it. And that is remarkable because by looking at art, we recognize in ourselves a virtue. We are not only interested in things instrumentally, because they can do something for us. The implication is that we are free, serving nothing, autonomous beings. Anyway, this is just a long-winded way of saying this is why the new critics say we need to take the autonomy of the poem seriously and not talk about what the author might have written to a friend about it or what he said in the newspaper interview about it. If the meaning isn't evident to the attentive reader, we can judge the poem unsuccessful. And this is where evaluation comes in. The poem's success depends on its realization of meaning, and not on anything outside of that. In order to read poetry, the new critics borrow Richard's experiential and subjective methodology. But they're not as much interested in behavioral psychology, and they critique Richard's reliance on cognitive and neurological effects. In fact, the new critics said looking at all these psychological effects made, and I quote them, the path to objectivity more difficult. So, what was objectivity to the new critics then? Well, poetry as a purely formal, semantic phenomenon. Not about affective or physiological responses, but about the complexity of language. Words tend to have 5 or 6 meanings, and the new critics delight in talking about all of them. That's legitimate evidence. The intention of the author isn't. One famous new critic was William Empson. And he actually was an undergrad student of Richard's. He switched to English from math and one day asked his teacher, hey, can I maybe work on ambiguity? Ambiguity seems to be an interesting thing in literature. And a few months later, Empson returned with one of the most important criticism books of the 20th century, 7 Types of Ambiguity. And that title tells you something about the things new critics like. Paradoxes, tensions, complexity. In this quote here, he offers a bit of a critique on his teacher. And it shows the difference between these two approaches. He says he's learned it's not about psychology, but about the passion for literature. It would be tempting then to say I was concerned with science rather than with beauty, to treat poetry as a branch of applied psychology. But so far as poetry can be regarded altogether dispassionately, so far as it is an external object for examination, it is dead poetry and not worth examining. Further, so far as a critic has made himself dispassionate about it, so far as he has repressed sympathy in favor of curiosity, he has made himself incapable of examining it. So, let's talk about the foundational concepts developed by the new critics. Some of them come, as we now know, from Richards, who wanted to separate the poem from its context of production. And like him, the new critics also sought to tackle certain misconceptions that were prevalent in literary criticism in their time, certain fallacies, as they called them. And there's 3 of them that I want to discuss here. The first one is the intentional fallacy. The design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of art. So basically, you shouldn't judge the merits of a work of art by the artist's intention. For instance, if you have a 5-year-old kid and he's drawn a cat and he comes up to you and says, look, I drew a cat, you're not supposed to say, is that supposed to be a cat? Oh, that's quite a bad representation you drew there. No, you should judge this drawing based on the horse that it looks like to you. Now, this goes for proper art as well. You cannot ask Van Gogh what he meant by Starry Night. You can only interpret what you see. When it comes to written works, you have what was later called the implied author or the dramatic speaker. And you have to attribute the happenings within the work and their meaning to that speaker and not the biographical author. If you read an I in a poem, you're not supposed to think that it's autobiographical. Finally, intention in art is always abstract and fluid. It's changing and not stable. Monet painted his famous lilies hundreds of times. Why? Well, because he was obsessed with them, and the way they turned out did not meet his original expectations or intentions. Now, if you think back on Schleiermacher, this all really complicates his desire to get to know the author better than they did themselves. Here's the second concept, which flows naturally from what we just discussed. It's called the affective fallacy. And this means to interpret text according to the psychological or emotional responses of the readers. So it's confusing the text with its results or effects. Monroe and Beardsley, two new critics, write, "The effective fallacy is a confusion between the poem and its results, what it is and what it does. A special case of epistemological skepticism, which begins by trying to derive the standard of criticism from the psychological effects of the poem and ends in impressionism and relativism, with the result that the poem itself, as an object of specifically critical judgment, tends to disappear." What do they mean by that? Well, look at any YouTube clip of a melancholic Coldplay track. It generally has as its highest ranking comments things along the lines of "I cried," as if that confers a sort of legitimacy to the song. But it's precisely that kind of response that is wrong to the new critics. For once, it's not about you. It's about this work of art. And talking about yourself in terms of your response to this work of art says nothing about it. It only says something about you. The third term is what's called the heresy of paraphrase. It's Clint Brooks' term, and he says, "A true poem is a simulacrum of reality, an experience rather than any mere statement about experience or any mere abstraction from experience." What does he mean by that? Well, for example, let's try to paraphrase the movie Titanic. Right? Just stop this video and try to be as accurate as possible and paraphrase what happens in this movie. Continue when you're done. The point of this heresy of paraphrase is you are missing so much by summarizing it like this. No matter how perfectly you have described the happenings in this movie, you miss the entire way in which that film progresses, how it makes its point, so to say. You're basically replacing the world of Titanic with another one, which necessarily impoverishes its capacity to speak to you. Have you ever taken a picture of a beautiful mountain when you were hiking or something, and then when you came back home and looked at the picture, you thought, "Oh my god, like this doesn't come through at all"? That's the point here. Given these three axioms or warnings, it becomes a lot clearer what the new critics meant with close reading. Here's Brooks again summarizing it. The new critics tend to force attention back to the text of the work itself. That is, to look at the poem as a poem, not as an appendage to the poet's biography, not as a reflection on his reading, nor as an illustration of the history of ideas. Such an emphasis naturally stresses a close reading of the text, since poems are written in words, careful attention to language. One example of how far you can go with this might be Jacques Derrida. He once devoted over 80 pages to the word yes in James Joyce's novel Ulysses. We'll discuss Derrida a bit more next week, but this is just to say how far you can go with a close reading, devoting 80 pages to one word. This is generally how precise and extensive close readings can get. Right, so try to keep in mind that the practice of close reading derives from these tenets of the new critics. And they're trying to understand what legitimate evidence looks like to understand art. We'll see how these concerns translate to actual close reading in this week's classes. See you then.